everyone. My name is Emily Louie, and on behalf of Campbell and Company, I would like to welcome you to Creating and Using Donor Personas for Online Fundraising. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly go through some logistics for those of you who may be new to our webinars. First, please close any programs other than GoToWebinar that are running on your computer. Next, we recommend calling in with a telephone instead of using your computer speakers. And finally, if you experience visual issues, please send a chat to Campbell and Company or contact GoToWebinar at the number on your screen. Today's webinar will last 60 minutes, and you'll earn one continuing education credit that is good with your participation with CFRE International. Within the next 24 hours, you will receive an email from GoToWebinar that includes information on how to download your certificate. In that same follow-up email, you'll also receive a link to download today's slides along with a link to the recording. We do welcome questions throughout the webinar, so please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel that should be on the right side of your computer screen. We will also hold time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters today, Senior Marketing Associate Molly Sachs and Communications Associate Consultant Anthony Ballas.
Thanks, Emily. I'm Molly Sachs, Senior Marketing Associate at Campbell & Company, as Emily mentioned. I manage content marketing strategy for our firm, which can range from webinars and research studies to blogs, emails, social media videos, and podcasts. When we're creating content and mapping out our calendar, we start with our audience and our buyer personas. We think about what would be valuable and interesting to them and what content would address their challenges and prompt them to consider Campbell & Company as a consulting partner. I'm also a member of our online fundraising team, where we've observed growing excitement and interest around donor personas. More and more organizations are seeing the value in focusing on their donors' unique motivations, interests, and challenges.
Great, and my name is Anthony Ballas. I'm an associate consultant on the 9-person communications team here at Campbell. I partner with organizations of all kinds around the country to do things like brainstorm, refine, and articulate stories that are aimed at securing philanthropic support and driving missions forward. I think one of the unique aspects about our team is our expertise helping organizations develop and use what we call a case for support, which is separate from the standard suite of marketing messages, since it's specifically used to prepare donors to make a decision about making a gift. Like Molly, I'm also a member of the online fundraising team, which allows me to take all that we learn when we help organizations develop their cases and apply it to the broader and more dynamic world of raising money online.
Over the next hour, we're going to dig into donor personas, starting with what they are and why they're useful. We'll move on to discussing how to create donor personas, then how to use them, and we'll finish up with some additional considerations your organization should take into account as you begin to use your personas. We've intentionally structured our webinar around the questions and potential objections you may have about donor personas. We wanted to address the skeptic in the virtual room and anticipate what they might ask. If you have additional questions along the way, please send them through the questions box, as Emily mentioned. We'll hold time in the middle of the webinar and at the end for your questions. For now, let's jump into our first question from the skeptic. What is a donor persona and why is it useful? Many of you may have a working knowledge of personas and ideas about their value proposition. To make sure we're all on the same page, we're going to spend a bit of time looking at where donor personas came from and why they matter. To fully understand the value of donor personas, we need to step into the for-profit arena for a moment. For-profit marketers have come a long way in the evolution of their craft. Marketing used to be much more seller-oriented. A company would produce a product, then figure out how to convince customers to purchase it, typically using one-size-fits-all mass communication, like a TV commercial or an ad in the newspaper. If we flash forward to today, so much has changed as technology has advanced and our understanding of consumer behavior has grown. Companies are now much more buyer-oriented. They're listening to consumers, developing products to meet customer needs, and personalizing their communications as much as possible to speak to the challenges, motivations, and interests of their target audience. Compare a TV commercial with an email campaign segmented for different audiences, or maybe a targeted ad on Instagram. That one-size-fits-all approach is fading in importance in favor of more customized solutions that start with understanding the buyer. There are many marketing strategies associated with this focus on the buyer, and content marketing is one of them. The Content Marketing Institute defines content marketing as a strategic marketing approach focused on creating and distributing valuable, relevant, and consistent content to attract and retain a clearly defined audience, and ultimately to drive profitable customer action. With content marketing, companies work to create and share content that their target audience cares about and wants to consume, rather than trying to sell products without providing value in their communications. Here at Campbell & Company, we create many downloadable resources, one being our comprehensive guide to Giving Tuesday. Rather than sending you a salesy email telling you we can help you execute a strong Giving Tuesday strategy, we show you by sending you a link to download our Giving Tuesday guide, which provides a valuable resource to you, demonstrates our expertise, and generates some interest and inquiries that way. Inbound marketing is another closely related strategy. Through inbound marketing, companies use blogging, social media, search engine optimization, and other related approaches to attract a target audience to their website and offer value. This compares with outbound marketing that can involve traditional advertising, mass emails to purchase lists, and telemarketing. As HubSpot explains, while outbound marketing interrupts your audience with content they don't want, inbound marketing forms connections they're looking for and solves problems they already have. Both content marketing and inbound marketing hinge on understanding the consumer, not just their demographics like age, gender, and income, but their psychographics, their interests, their attitudes, their motivations. And that's where buyer personas come in. Per HubSpot, a buyer persona is a semi-fictional representation of your ideal customer based on market research and real data about your existing customers. Using buyer personas to guide marketing efforts is a common practice in the for-profit world, especially as our need to stand out in the crowded communications environment and our ability to segment and personalize digital outreach both increase. With that for-profit context in mind, let's pivot back to the nonprofit sector. Donor personas are an adaptation of buyer personas, and nonprofit organizations can learn a lot by trying to understand their donors in the same way that companies are striving to understand their customers. So let's take another look at the HubSpot definition of a buyer persona, but this time we swapped out references to customers for donors. A donor persona is a semi-fictional representation of your ideal donor based on market research and real data about your existing supporters. Now that we have a working definition, let's look at a few specific ways that donor personas add value to your development shop. In a few minutes here, Anthony is going to walk us through the process of creating donor personas. When your team comes together to do that, or you do it yourself if you're a one-person shop, you're engaging in an enormously valuable thought exercise. If you've been at your organization for some time, you probably think you know your donor base pretty well. You might not know each annual donor individually, but you likely think you understand what types of people give to your organization and what motivates them to give. You might be right or partially right, but going through the process of developing personas gives you the chance to voice those assumptions, then step out of your organizational bubble and test their accuracy. In creating a set of donor personas, you're in effect taking segmentation a step further. You're not just thinking of your donor base according to gift size or generation. You're diving deeper and going beyond simple demographics. In this way, you can uncover additional attributes and assemble a fuller picture of your different segments of donors. And once you've gone through the process of creating personas, you can use them to refine your communication strategy. With a deeper understanding of who you're talking to, you'll be able to craft messages that resonate better with your donor base. Your personas can also inform what communications channels you use and when. And finally, creating and using donor personas encourages stronger donor engagement and higher retention. If you're talking to donors how they want to be talked to and engaging them how they want to be engaged, you're more likely to feel connected, they're more likely to feel connected with your organization and continue to give. So let's review a sample persona to bring it all together. There's a lot on the screen right now for you to take in, but I'm going to quickly touch on each section. This is a basic donor persona. You may decide to create personas with more categories and details, but this is the bare minimum of what we recommend. So let me introduce you to mid-level donor Mary. She has a bio. Mary is a consistent donor and volunteer to our nonprofit and a proud supporter of our work. She's raising her children to understand the importance of supporting their community, especially as they get older. We use that bio and the stock photo image to humanize our donor persona. There's also a section for demographics. Here we included age, family description, education, employment, income, and neighborhood. The identifiers section includes key behaviors and attitudes your donor has, especially those that relate to your cause or organization. For Mary, we laid out her giving and volunteering behavior, as well as some of her ideological values. The goals section is pretty self-explanatory, things that this group cares about and aspires to. Mid-level donor Mary cares about giving to her top causes, planning for early retirement, paying for the college tuition of her kids, and taking care of her aging parents. And finally, the challenges section represents reasons the persona group might stop, resist, or decrease their engagement with your organization. For Mary, she's time crunched and has financial concerns and other philanthropic priorities. At this point, you may be thinking, that's all well and good, but no two donors are exactly alike, so I don't want to lump my supporters together. I'm going to take a moment to quickly speak to that concern. It really comes down to the title of this slide, more personalization, better understanding. It's hard to keep track of differences between groups of donors if you're storing all that knowledge in your head, rather than formulating it into a helpful tool that you can print out, tack up in your office, and share with your colleagues. It's sort of akin to the difference between knowing you have a lot to get done and actually creating a to-do list. And these devices of simplification, even when they seem silly, are devices that we use all the time. Think about things like, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, to remember the order of operations in math class. It's a simplification, and you might feel a little bit hokey using it, but it's a tool we use to make our lives easier. In a perfect world, we wouldn't need donor personas because we would relate to each and every donor on a one-to-one basis. Well, this is possible in major giving. It's not feasible for your broader base of donors. Donor personas are the best tools for the task at hand. They don't facilitate that one-to-one relationship, but they get you closer than a one-size-fits-all strategy. And oftentimes, we see organizations pushing the same message and cultivation strategy to all their annual donors without considering the diversity of their motivations, interests, and backgrounds. When you have the opportunity to do tailored outreach based on a set of donor personas, it's going to be more effective than general outreach, where you're hoping that your generic message will land well with everyone. And as we'll see next, going through the persona development process will also bring you closer to your supporters and foster greater awareness of the variety that exists within your donor base. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Anthony to walk us through that donor persona creation process.
Thanks so much, Molly. So in my view, there's sort of this explicit end game behind donor personas, which is to make broad-based donor messaging easier. But I think it also turns out that the process of developing them is helpful in and of itself. It's an exercise that builds mutual understanding among staff members around who donors are and what's most important to them. That's basically to say that in walking through the donor persona creation steps, we're going to find value in both the destination or outcome and the journey. So in almost all circumstances, the best way to get started is to charge one person, and that could be yourself, with developing a basic outline of different kinds of organizational supporters based on nothing more than intuition. A question that you can use to get started is really simple. It's, if I were to break our supporters into 3 different groups, what would those groups be? And if you're a development officer, I think you can get a little bit more specific with this. You can ask, When you recall your portfolio, what are the most common denominators among your donors? To provide a fictional but I think plausible real-world example, you might work at a mid-sized public university and think, oh, well, we have our younger alumni and our older alumni, or we have our engineering donors, our business donors, and our pharmacy donors. The idea is to be able to verbalize the assumptions that you make each day when you think about who your donor base is composed of. So in the cases when the advancement or development office of an organization has multiple layers, we are going to tend to prefer a persona development process that engages folks across the team. So ideally, it's not a one-person job. This group could be anyone who interfaces with mid-level donors, anyone who writes or oversees messaging that goes out through digital platforms, any annual giving or online fundraising focused staff, and anyone who manages records in a donor database. So if you're this mid-sized university that I just mentioned, you'd be off to a really good start if you gathered some sort of group that includes one or more directors of development from your different professional schools, an alumni affairs or annual giving staff person, and anyone else who might frequently interact with or solicit alumni and donors. So the physical act of gathering gives people the opportunity to react to the groups that you've created and then answer questions about what they feel is motivating those different groups to give in the first place. The outcome of this meeting should be a deepened and most importantly, a shared sense of donor motivations across different donor groups. Definitely not an endpoint, but it's a milestone, just a way of saying that without conducting any research, this is where we're at. As far as the format goes, we definitely don't want to make too many claims about how to structure meetings, but we feel this is an opportunity to make these early conversations almost take the form of a retreat. So it's using 60 or 90 minutes to take a step back, listen, reflect, and brainstorm in a collaborative way. So with some prep work under your belt to assess where your team is at, you can move on to the actual design of your research process, which is really going to bridge the gap between informal thoughts on how to group donors and then robust donor personas that can help take your broad-based fundraising to a new level. So depending on your personal and organizational bandwidth, there are a number of research practices you'll want to consider at this point. The first is reviewing information in your database, including wealth data, demographics, giving frequency, anything that's quantifiable, really. Then conducting interviews or focus groups with donors and distributing an electronic survey for donors to take. So these last points, interviews and surveys, are important because they give donors the chance to provide insight into their thinking behind supporting your organization. When you reach the stage of scheduling these interviews, you'll probably wonder how many conversations you should set up. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule about how many to set up, but we've found success with as little as 4 to 5 conversations, ideally more, but 4 to 5 is a good place to start. And I think this number can be even less if you're talking exclusively to your own staff. The idea, though, is to seek enough viewpoints to begin hearing some of the same kinds of responses. If your organization or institution has volunteer groups like an alumni association or an advisory board, these groups can be helpful to leverage when it comes to organizing focus groups. Now, as a reminder, we will always say that when selecting folks to speak to, it's worth engaging a broad range of ages, giving levels, and years of giving to your organization. And it's also worth mentioning that this preference for a broad sample size is one of the reasons a survey can be so helpful. You can just reach more people. So I'm going to start sounding like a broken record when I say that a broad approach, one that incorporates interviews, focus groups, and database reviews, is best. But at the end of the day, the questions that you have prepared are what's most important here. So with that in mind, whatever conversation format you land on, when you're conducting research, you want to ask questions that fall into a few basic categories. The first is just basic background and giving habits. How did the donor learn about your organization? What first motivated them to make a gift? What does their giving look like now? And where does the organization stand among their other giving priorities? The second category is a little bit more nuanced, and it's around motivations and obstacles. what kind of developments at the organization make them most excited or invested? And then on the flip side, what kind of questions have they had about the organization, and have there been any points of frustration? And then the last is, what comes to mind generally when they're choosing to give to any organization? What external factors do they consider, like saving for their kids' college or paying off childcare or other important life decisions? The last category is just communication. It's asking how they want to be reached, whether that's direct mail, email, social media, or text. Obviously, the ability to ask some of these questions is going to depend on your level of familiarity with the donor, especially when you explore things like unanswered questions or frustrations. It really is okay to tailor the questions to the conversation based on what you know about the donor. And I want to underscore at this point that the data collection is critical. In focus groups or one-on-one settings, you want to take careful notes so that the information can be reviewed in aggregate when you're through conducting the conversations. So you've reached this place where you've completed all your interviews or your survey is closed, and it's time to start synthesizing the responses you've collected. So earlier, Molly introduced the donor personas framework that we use. When you finally reach this potentially daunting stage of trudging your way through notes, I think this template is always a good place to begin. It's a way for you to start categorizing the trends that arise in the information that you've gathered. Now, you'll notice here that we're using 5 different categories that Molly already mentioned. So that's a basic bio and demographics, identifiers or behaviors, the goals, and then the goals and challenges that will influence how a donor makes a decision. This is our go-to set for lots of the persona development that we do, but you could absolutely incorporate additional categories like hobbies, their daily routine, a preferred mode of communication, or even an imagined quotation that's representative of what's important about that person, which might help you remember what you need to know when you're thinking through messaging. As you start to analyze your notes, the idea isn't to fit each participant neatly into 3 or 4 clean templates. Instead, I think you might begin this process by filling in a persona template using just one interview, and then proceed by modifying it when you encounter other feedback from other interviews that's similar or feels like it could coincide with the first interview you used. The goal is to keep doing this until you've developed several unique templates that could each plausibly describe more than one person that you engaged. So we're limited with the amount of space we have on screen, but what is on the screen would be just one of the multiple personas you want to try to create. So once you've taken some time to work through the development of a persona, you'll ideally end up with something like the one we have here, which is typical for the kinds we develop for higher education clients. I think it's worth pointing out just how much this extends beyond the demographics section in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Yes, you know that at 71, this fictional, family-oriented Fiona is at the older range of your donor base. But you also know some more nuanced details, particularly that there's at least a subset of people in this age group who feel a need to leave a legacy and give back to the institutions that shaped their own lives. I think this sits in direct contrast with another persona that you could develop in essentially the same 10-year age range, where Bernice, who is also a baby boomer, which is a segment that can often be overly reduced in the minds of a lot of people, she has a motivation for giving that is much more tied to solving problems and seeing community change rather than giving back. So Molly is going to explore much more deeply how to use personas like these, but the difference between the persona for Fiona and Bernice that we just showed you, I think is an example of taking segmentation a step further and getting to the nuance that will help you craft more tailored and effective messaging. And I know it's worth saying that we send this presentation out after the webinar, so analyzing the differences between those two slides is going to be really helpful. So I suspect at this point it's entirely possible that there are folks out there who feel sort of ambivalent about the process in that, yes, it is totally exciting to think about digging deeper and using interviews with donors to inform your messaging, but also there is no way there is time to fit this into the plan for the fiscal year. Our first response to this concern is that we do ultimately feel that the creation of donor personas should be viewed as an investment. It is a lot of upfront work that, when done right, will help you communicate more effectively with supporters, raise more money, and retain more donors. But we also absolutely understand that each organization is in a different place and is limited with a finite set of resources. At any one moment, a full-fledged research-based persona development process like we just outlined might not be realistic. It's why that in cases where interviews, surveys, or focus groups just aren't feasible, we like to recommend the creation of proto-personas, or personas that are developed by speaking with frontline fundraisers. At a basic level, this idea assumes that the first two steps that we introduced, so voicing your opinions and gathering your team, can still be an invaluable way to create a persona-like framework and better inform your donor communications. For proto-personas, we recommend a simple reframing of the questions that we introduced earlier. So you want to ask, what other causes or organizations are your prospects supporting? What makes them most excited, more likely to give again, or more likely to give more, and why? What questions do you encounter most frequently from donor prospects, and what frustrates them, and why do you think that is? It's always best to get information about motivations from the source, i.e. the donors themselves, but we want to acknowledge the expertise of frontline fundraising here. Frontline fundraisers here, a tongue twister. And so we absolutely recommend this scaled down approach if a more robust approach is not immediately available. Also, we know that when you have direct access to your colleague's calendar, it's a lot easier to sit down with them. And with that, I think I want to take a break for a second and see if there are any questions based on the outline of those initial steps.
Thanks, Anthony. We have a few questions so far. Our first one being, what are examples of tailoring messaging to align with the persona examples?
Well, Molly, I think you're going to get to that in just a second. Am I right that you feel like our content later on covers that pretty well?
Yeah, I definitely agree, Anthony. But let us know, whoever asked that question, if you have additional questions about that. When we'll get to our final Q&A break. But we will be addressing that in the next section, so stay tuned for that.
Great. And then I guess our final question is there any place for donor personas in major gifts work?
That's a great question. My immediate answer is it's less relevant for major gifts work just because you're in that one-to-one relationship. So you're not thinking as much about grouping your donors into specific segments. It should really be even more individualized than that. But I would say it's always good to get the feedback and perspective of those frontline fundraisers, those major gift officers, and whether you can involve them in that initial retreat or meeting that Anthony described earlier, or whether you just share them just to make sure you're not, siloed. I think however you can involve them, that's great.
I think for what it's worth, we do a lot of work with frontline fundraisers and major gift officers. And really these questions might be, they might feel a little bit formal for the relationships that major gift officers have already established. However, it's a good framework to keep in mind. I think if you sort of run through these questions that are asked in the research step that we proposed, and you feel like, hey, I don't know that about, a number of people in my portfolio, it's good to revisit those and think, okay, how can I get some more information from the people who are considering that major level of philanthropic support? So that's what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Thank you. And if we have time for just one more, this next one asked, you mentioned thinking of this as an investment in time. How do you help sell prioritizing this to organization leadership?
That's a great question. I would just point to if your organization is and leadership is very resistant to this, I would say you can always go through the proto-persona exercise. We'll talk a little bit more about A/B testing and things that can help you prove your ROI in the next section. But if you can come with that, research and show that this is making a difference, it might help to go through that fully fledged research process, which is a little bit more in depth. Anthony,
Yeah,
would you
and I
add
think
anything there?
Yeah, I think just one of the points that you covered earlier, Molly, emphasizing that this is not even just a nonprofit industry best practice, but that this is something that we see in the for-profit arena as well. I think pointing to that credential that buyer personas are, a regnant piece of how marketing is functioning can be just a good proof point. I know that there's research out there that shows the effectiveness of buyer personas. So digging into some of that, it's something that I know Campbell and Company wants to do more of. So I think just referencing that as a proof point can't hurt in the justification of the time and resources that go into a process like this.
Definitely.
Great, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Emily. Well, with that, we're going to move into the next section of how to use donor personas. So you might be asking yourself, we created a set of donor personas, now what? What are the next steps? As we've been explaining, they're meant to be a very flexible resource. So each organization is going to proceed a bit differently from here. But I'm going to take us through general areas that you should consider when you're deciding how to use your donor persona. Let's dive in. I first want to start with a quick note on segmenting donors by persona group in your database. If this is feasible for your organization, we recommend this as the next step once you've completed your donor personas. Segmentation at this time is going to give you the ability to send each group unique emails and snail mail and track progress for each persona group. Things like average gift size, annual retention rate, and other key performance indicators that are important to your fundraising program. You may already be segmenting your donors in other ways, such as current donors versus lapsed donors, but I would encourage you to rethink the way you're segmenting using personas as a guide. Carrying this out will look differently from organization to organization based on size, resources, and just how you're using your database. So I'm not going to get too into the weeds here, but I would encourage you to talk with your database manager to understand if and how this might be possible. All personas are going to include a constellation of characteristics, as we've shown, and not all of those characteristics are going to be recorded in your database, especially attitudinal ones. But more basic demographics that are associated with each persona, like giving behavior or age, could help you segment within your database. For more sophisticated organizations, we've seen each donor receive an attribute in the system that defines their persona group. But many organizations won't have the ability to do this, and that's okay. If you're a small nonprofit or otherwise don't have the resources to support this type of segmentation, donor personas can still be a useful resource to guide your outreach. You'll just need to make sure that your communication strategy incorporates messages that are tailored for each of your personas throughout the year. Now that we've touched on segmentation in the database, we're going to explore how you can use your donor personas to guide communication strategy and customize content for each group. I'm going to use an example to walk us through this section. So before we go any further, I'll share 3 donor personas from a fictional conservation nonprofit. A quick disclaimer here. The personas I'm going to share are very pared down. When you're creating your own personas, I highly recommend you include more detail that we referenced earlier, but these persona sketches will give you a quick feel for who we're targeting. So our first persona is longtime supporter Lydia. She's in her 60s or 70s and is retired. Lydia has donated to our conservation nonprofit for years. She knows its history and she's lived in our region her whole life. Next is outdoors enthusiast Oliver. Oliver's younger than Lydia. He's in his 40s or 50s and he's mid-career or later. As his persona name suggests, he spends his free time outdoors in our region, perhaps hiking, biking, fishing, or camping. He's primarily interested in our projects that focus on conserving or expanding recreation areas within the region. And finally, there's politically active Priya. Priya is in her 20s or 30s and is a college or graduate student or early in her professional career. She's progressive and is highly involved in local and state politics. She canvasses before elections, she attends community meetings, and she's following and keeping up with what's happening legislatively. Priya's primary interest in our organization is our environmental advocacy work, but she's less knowledgeable about the full range of what we're doing with conservation work. So as you can tell, each of these persona groups have different goals, different aspects of our work that they care about, and different motivations for supporting our organization. So it stands to reason that we would communicate differently with each group throughout the year. So let's take a closer look at how we can put these three personas to work. Whether you're mapping out your communication strategy for the year or making tweaks from month to month or week to week, you should be using your donor personas as a starting point. So when the development staff at our conservation organization meet to discuss their communication strategy, that conversation should begin with Lydia, Oliver, and Priya. We've already done the hard work of identifying these donor groups and creating our personas. Now we need to make sure we're referencing them whenever we're talking big picture strategy. I like to think of personas as your North Star. They'll keep you on track and help you ensure you're not wasting time on communications that aren't a good fit for your audience. You'll also want to have your personas handy when you're developing content. On the next slide, we're going to look at what kind of content our conservation nonprofit might create for Priya, Oliver, and Lydia. When you're planning out your annual communications calendar, make sure you're building in touch points for each persona group and spacing them out so each group is hearing from you throughout the year. And as you're populating this calendar, be sure to follow the 80-20 rule, which means that only 20% of your content should be fundraising appeals. The other 80% should focus on adding value by reporting on impact through metrics and compelling stories, by sharing program information, by educating the donor on your cause, or just by entertaining them. And if you can't segment donors in your database, we still recommend starting with more starting with more general messaging that appeals to the broadest audience at the beginning of the year, and then tailoring your outreach as the year goes on. So you're incorporating more persona-specific messaging there. So let's dive a little bit deeper and take a look at what kind of content and outreach would best engage each of our personas at our conservation nonprofit. For longtime supporter Lydia, we could develop a blog series that focuses on how conservation work impacts the region. Lydia has lived in the area all her life and is deeply rooted here, so stories that connect her conservation work with education, recreation, health, and the regional economy will really resonate with her. And if we know that Lydia is fairly active on Facebook, we might do a Throwback Thursday series of posts on our page that share photos and stories from earlier decades in our organization's history, which will speak to Lydia in a unique way as a longtime supporter of ours. And since Lydia is such a loyal donor, we know she's willing to give us an unrestricted gift, and we sent her an appeal for general operating support through a coordinated direct mail email campaign. So Lydia is going to receive a mailing, then an email with similar messaging a week later if she hasn't already made a gift. When it comes to outdoors enthusiast Oliver, we know he has more of a transactional relationship with us. He supports our recreation-focused projects because that supports his favorite hobbies. So we decided to create an ebook on the hidden gems of outdoor recreation in the region for Oliver, knowing that he's already well-versed in the popular recreation spots. We also launched a social media campaign titled Ours to Preserve that's going to feature videos and photos of hikers, cyclists, climbers, and other outdoors enthusiasts in our area who are passionate about our conservation work. We're designing this to speak to Oliver and work to move him from a transactional relationship with our organization to a much more meaningful one. And when it comes to soliciting Oliver, we know he'll be interested in supporting a trail maintenance project that's underway, so we sent him an email appeal for that. For politically active Priya, we decided to send her texts with updates on our advocacy work to keep her informed about important initiatives. But we also want to share more about the full range of our work with Priya, so we write blogs that connect our impact on policy and conservation, showing her how the two are intertwined through a series of stories. And right after Election Day, we're going to send an email appeal to Priya, building on the momentum of reminding her of our environmental policy wins and what we can accomplish with her support. So with all that laid out, I just want to take a step back and point out that even though this content is very customized for each persona, some of it may appeal across groups. So while we created the Hidden Gems ebook with Oliver in mind, Lydia and Priya may also find that interesting. And the Throwback Thursday Facebook post designed for Lydia may also catch Priya's eye and help introduce her to our history and the broader scope of our work. So the bottom line is that sometimes the content you create is much more flexible than you originally realized. From here, I'm going to pivot to social media and email and share a few considerations there in terms of personas. So when it comes to using personas to influence your social media strategy, it's important to first understand the social media preferences of your various personas. Maybe you have a persona that isn't active on social media at all, so you won't post updates that are designed for that group. Or maybe you have a younger persona group that's highly active on Instagram. You might decide to exclusively devote your Instagram account to reaching that segment of your audience. But oftentimes, there won't be such a clear-cut division. Perhaps you have a couple donor personas that are primarily active on Facebook. Make sure you're posting a mix of content that will appeal to each group. And do take note of the date that you start using personas to guide your social media strategy. That way, once a few months have passed, you can compare engagement metrics and other performance indicators before personas and after to see if your work has made a difference. My final thought on social media. Be sure to factor in personas when you're creating and targeting ads. Whether you can segment personas in your database or not, you can target a specific persona through a social media ad. The specifics will vary from platform to platform, but be aware that this is a tool you can use if you have the budget and it makes sense for your goals. If you can segment your emails by persona, by all means do, but be sure not to let perfect be the enemy of good. Let's say you work at a fairly large or complex organization, and you have 6 well-defined personas within your donor base. It may feel daunting to create 6 separate messages every time you want to send a newsletter update on program outcomes. Maybe you just don't have the staff resources to do that. In that case, consider grouping your personas into 3 categories and creating messages for those. Just because you can segment doesn't mean you always have to get that granular. And I also want to point out that sometimes customizing a message for each persona only requires a small tweak. Perhaps you use different language in your call to action, swap out a photo, or tailor a few sentences. Taking your personas into account doesn't mean you need to start from scratch and create 6 completely unique emails. Do what makes sense for your situation and your workload. As you're segmenting emails, remember that you can A/B test your messages to see what appeals most to different personas. This is especially helpful when you start out, and it's a good thing to do periodically to make sure you're on the right track. Maybe you're not 100% sure what calls to action will resonate with a certain group. In A/B tests, you can try out 2 options and identify the winning message. And for those of you who can't segment by persona, just be sure your email calendar includes a mix of content for each of your personas. Yes, donors will receive some messages that aren't tailored for them. They'll also receive content that speaks to their unique interests. It's a compromise, but it's a step up from generic messaging. So let's revisit Lydia, Oliver, and Priya at this point. We're going to take a look at a one-size-fits-all message, then tweak it for each persona. So our conservation nonprofit is sending out an email appeal. Without personas, we might include this message in our email. We depend on the support of donors like you to fund the vital environmental work we do. Please help us conserve the wild spaces in our region by making a gift today. That's fine, but it's pretty generic and it doesn't speak particularly well to any of our 3 personas. When we take their interests and motivations into account, however, we can craft much more effective asks. So let's take a look. We're so thankful to have the support of people like you who understand the value of conservation and the impact we've had over our 50-year history. Help us continue this legacy with a gift today. With your help, we can ensure that nature lovers all over our region have wild spaces to roam in. Please donate today to protect our forests, streams, trails, and vistas that tie it all together. It's never been more important to protect our wild spaces, and we're on the front lines in our region through advocacy and conservation. Donate today. With your support, we can keep marching on. So you can see that when you know who you're talking to, it is so much easier to write a message that will resonate with them. In all these messages, we're asking for the same thing. We're tapping into what moves and motivates our donor groups with the latter three. And that can make all the difference between a deleted email and a donation. So that was a lot of information. Pausing for a water break. Let's break for another question from our skeptic. What if it makes sense to segment a fundraising appeal in a different way? My short answer, you should do it. Donor personas are far from the only way you can segment your audience. As we've emphasized throughout the webinar, donor personas are meant to be a flexible resource, not something that's going to constrain you or stop you from pursuing a smart strategy that doesn't fit within your framework. There are various ways you might segment your communications beyond your donor personas, but I'll share 3 examples here. Number 1, when you want to speak directly to your monthly donors. If your monthly donors aren't a distinct persona group, you still may want to send them customized messages from time to time. For instance, when you're sending a fundraising email, you should acknowledge their recurring giving before asking for an additional gift. Number 2, in December, when you want to speak to donors who haven't made a gift yet this year. You may want to reach out to live months and 5 months when you get to year-end fundraising, and those categories probably won't correlate perfectly with your personas. And number 3, when you have a general message that you don't want to segment. Even in this era of the more customization, the better, you're still going to have communications that don't need to be ultra-tailored. This could be a message from your CEO with updates and basic information that applies to all your supporters. Just remember that even if you choose not to segment by persona, you should still consider how your personas would respond. Go through the thought exercise to make sure you're not missing anything that might be relevant. And now I'm going to hand it back to Anthony to take us over the finish line.
Great, thank you, Molly. I think one of the key upshots that I was hoping people would take away from this webinar is that a donor persona is so much more than a static resource. It's both a process and a tool that can be an ongoing genesis of conversation about how an organization is working with stakeholders to advance its mission. So when your office has taken the investment or undergone the investment of creating these donor personas, there are a few important things you can do to keep getting optimal use out of them. The first one, and I know this ties back to one of our earlier points about gathering a team together, is sharing the donor personas with internal folks across the organization. While it's good if the personas are owned by marketing or annual giving teams, sharing more broadly is a great way to either A, help other less donor-facing facets of an organization be more informed about the organization's network of support, or B, elicit more feedback about how well the donor personas seem calibrated in the eyes of people who have a different perspective. In reality, it will hopefully achieve both of those things. It's also worth subjecting the donor personas to the quantitative scrutiny of methods like A/B testing, where you can measure the effectiveness of one message, say that's personalized by personas, versus another that's more general, by looking at click rates or open rates. It's a way of saying either, yes, we're on the right track, or no, we need to keep revisiting these. And that takes me to my last point, which is that organizations and supporters are way too dynamic for donor personas to be permanent. As support grows and as programs evolve, the motivations behind giving are inevitably going to change. So revisiting donor personas on a regular basis is a great way to ensure that your tools are mapping onto the reality of the moment. We know some organizations who undergo this process annually, and we love that idea. It's a way to get people oriented or provide them with a refreshed sense of why the work of the organization is resonating with supporters. And with that, I will kick it back to Emily for the last audience Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. We do have a few questions. Our first being, how many donor personas is too many donor personas? Is there a number range that you've found useful?
That's a really great question, and I don't want to answer it with a non-answer, but I think I'll first say that it really depends on your donor base, and it really depends on how big your donor base is, what type of organization you are. I think you should never take on more donor personas than you can handle. So I think we would recommend starting with 2 to 3 if you're a smaller organization. And, I could see, up to 7 if you're really a large and sophisticated organization. If you're a college or university with a lot of different departments and divisions, different schools might want to have their own set of donor personas. So it can go in a lot of different ways, but I would say, start with that. Maybe 3 is the sweet spot to start with.
Yeah, Molly, for what it's worth, I believe one of our clients shared with us a list of donor personas that included 8 separate personas. And to me, that strikes me very much on the high end. And I'm sure there are organizations who have more personas at the ready to help them with their messaging. But I think Molly is spot on that, starting off small and seeing to what extent those are useful and feel sufficiently, representative of your donor base, that is the right way to start.
Yeah, I think it's mostly, underlined by usability. Like if you have 8 personas and you can execute on them, that's great. But how are you actually, segmenting things, and how are you using them to plan out your communication strategy? I would start there.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is, do you have any recommendations on how to gather demographic data on your broader donor base?
That's a great question. I would say a donor survey is one way that, can come in handy. And I know that's something that Anthony talked about earlier in the webinar. So that's one way that we recommend, gathering broader answers. But I would also say, depending on what you have already recorded in your donor base, so your database, So if you can have your database manager or someone else, run those reports, whether that's segmenting by, by age or by some other demographic, you could start there.
I think that's spot on.
Great, thank you. And our next question is, how can you balance customization and authenticity to your purpose and mission? For example, is it possible that each of these donors would have a skewed or partial understanding of the work and mission of the conservation nonprofit?
That's a really interesting, and I keep saying that's a good question, but these are all great questions. I think that comes to probably another question that our skeptic could have asked during this webinar. Our donor personas, do they get too reductive? So I think you have to take them with a grain of salt and just always approach it with this is not, we can't actually cleanly divide our donor base into these 3 pockets. And even if we could, they have so many other motivations and interests, and they're fully formed human beings. So you just have to sort of keep that in mind and not become overly reductive.
Well, one thing I would say too is that a good check for an effective donor persona is, does it have that kind of tip of the tongue quality where, maybe you're in a room and you're sort of strategizing around, what are our, 8 messages that we want to communicate in this annual report. If a donor persona is able to, map on really closely, I think like the outdoor enthusiast Oliver is a great example where, you have that set of donors, if you're an environmental organization who just care so much about using outdoor spaces, asking yourself whether or not the donor persona is capturing the kind of person you feel like I mean, I understand that that's not a quantitative test by any means, but I think, that's a moment where if you can put a name to sort of a feeling you have about your donor set, then it is effective. And if it's not coming up in conversations that you're having about messages, then maybe yes, it is a little bit too reductive.
I also add, as when you were saying that, Anthony, it reminded me another good way to sort of guard against being inauthentic or overly reductive is to do what Anthony talked about in terms of revisiting your donor personas regularly, and not only refreshing them, but just saying, this still represent our donor base well. And I think one other point I'll add here is just that while it can sometimes feel overly reductive, particularly when you're going through that research-based persona process, you're actually reaching out to your donors, talking with them, asking them these questions. And so while you're ultimately going to put together a composite, it gives you the chance to talk to them about their unique motivations and interests. So you're actually getting closer to them in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you so much. And then our final question is, if I find out we have a persona group that is highly active on a social media platform that our organization doesn't have a presence, should we open an account there?
Opening new social media accounts, that is always a can of worms. I think that you have to proceed cautiously, and it's definitely, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. I think you should never open a social media account just to open it. So, if you find out you have a donor persona group that is highly active on this site, that you're not there, that's a good indication that you should at least check it out. See if you have the bandwidth and the resources. Think about what your strategy there would be and how you would use it. But you should never dive into a social media channel just for the sake of diving in. There should always be some sort of strategy and plan to actively manage it behind it.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Melanie.
Thank you. All right.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sending us your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Emily, and thank you all for joining us today. We hope you tune in for future Campbell and Company webinars, and I'm going to do a quick plug for 2 coming up in February. We have fundraising collaboration in the arts and culture sector on February 3rd, and donor messages that resonate on February 19th. So we hope to see you there. If you do have any questions for me or Anthony, our emails are up here, and please feel free to reach out to us. And we hope to see you for future webinars. Thanks, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.